Prepare to delve into a tale that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. Today we'll explore together one of the most enigmatic cases ever to emerge from the depths of the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia. A story that began in the winter of 1892 and that to this day leaves more questions than answers. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I wonder if anyone out there is familiar with these mysterious mountains. The Appalachian Mountains have always carried with them an aura of isolation and closely guarded secrets. In the late 19th century, Virginia was still a land of dense forests, deep valleys, and communities so far apart that they could go months without contact with the outside world. Roads were poor, often just trails cut through the ancient trees. Winter arrived early at these altitudes, bringing heavy snow that covered everything like a silent blanket, further isolating those who chose to live there. It was in this setting of rugged beauty and unsettling solitude that the Caldwell family had established their estate. Thomas Caldwell and his wife, Margaret, arrived in the area around 1870, lured by the promise of cheap land and the possibility of living away from the increasingly bustling cities of the East Coast. They built a sturdy wooden house high on a hill, surrounded by oak and pine trees that seemed to touch the sky. The property was approximately 15 kilometers from the nearest town, a village called Grayson Mills, which had barely 200 inhabitants. Thomas was known as a reserved man of few words who rarely came down to town. Margaret, on the other hand, was described by her few neighbors as a woman with a distant look in her eyes, always dressed in black, even before any official mourning. The couple kept their distance from everyone, declining invitations to community gatherings at the local church and avoiding any kind of socializing. This seclusion was not uncommon in the mountains, where many families preferred the company of solitude, but there was something about the Caldwells that provoked an inexplicable discomfort in those who crossed their path. The Caldwell estate was extensive, covering about 100 acres, but only a small portion was cultivated. Most remained untouched, a dense forest that swallowed all sound and where sunlight struggled to penetrate even on the brightest days. There were sporadic reports of travelers, lost on the mountain trails, approaching the estate in search of shelter or directions. Some of these travelers continued on their way without incident. Others, however, simply disappeared, leaving behind only rumors and whispered speculation in the dark corners of local taverns. In the fall of 1891, more concrete stories began to emerge. A traveling merchant named Henry Patterson had last been seen near the Caldwell estate. He sold tools, fabrics, and medicines throughout isolated mountain communities, a valuable service for those living far from commercial centers. Henry was known for his punctuality and commitment to his roots. When he failed to appear in 3 consecutive villages on his usual route, his family in Roanoke grew concerned. Weeks later, his horse was found wandering alone near a stream a few miles from the Caldwell estate. The wagon, the goods, and Henry himself were never located. 2 months later, it was the turn of Sarah Jennings, a traveling teacher who traveled between remote communities offering basic reading and arithmetic lessons. Sarah was 28 years old and admired for her courage in traveling alone on those dangerous trails. She had mentioned in her last letter to her sister that she planned to visit some isolated families in the northern region of Grayson Mills, an area that included the Caldwell property. Sarah never reached her final destination. Her leather bag containing books and a few personal belongings was found abandoned on the side of a trail, but there were no signs of a struggle or any clues to her whereabouts. The Grayson County Sheriff at the time was a man named William Hutchinson, a Civil War veteran known for his methodical approach to investigations. Hutchinson began to notice a disturbing pattern. Over the past 2 years, at least 5 people had disappeared near that particular mountainous region. All were travelers, people without strong ties to the local community, individuals whose absence might go unnoticed for weeks or even months, and all had been last seen on routes that passed dangerously close to the Caldwell property. The sheriff decided to pay the family an informal visit. It was early December when he and his deputy, a young man named Robert Hayes, climbed the steep trail to the Caldwell home. Snow had begun to fall lightly, covering the path with a thin, crunchy layer. When they arrived, they were greeted by Thomas on the porch. The man had an unkempt appearance, a long, unkempt beard, and dirt-stained clothes. His eyes were small and wary, constantly averting his gaze. Thomas was polite but firm, saying he hadn't seen any travelers recently, and that they rarely received visitors. Margaret appeared briefly in the doorway, a pale, silent silhouette who observed the conversation without uttering a single word. Sheriff Hutchinson requested permission to look around the property, but Thomas politely refused, citing his right to privacy and the protection of his land. Without a warrant or concrete evidence, the sheriff had no legal authority to insist. He and the deputy descended the mountain with a nagging feeling that something was deeply wrong there, but with nothing tangible to justify more aggressive action. The laws of the time strongly protected property rights, and trespassing on a citizen's land without probable cause could result in serious legal consequences for authorities. The winter of 1891 to 1892 was particularly brutal in the mountains. Snow accumulated more than a meter in some areas, and temperatures dropped to dangerous levels. Trails became impassable, and communities were completely isolated from each other for months. During this period of white silence and biting cold, no one could come or go, and the mountain's secrets were buried under layers of ice and temporary oblivion. But spring, as always, would eventually come, and with it, revelations no one was prepared for. When spring finally arrived in the Appalachian Mountains in March 1892, the thaw brought with it more than just a rebirth of nature. Streams ran murky and turbulent, carrying the remnants of winter down the mountain. It was during this period of transformation that a disturbing discovery would completely change the course of the investigation into the disappearances in the region. A farmer named Jacob Thornton was repairing fences on his property, located about 5 miles east of the Caldwell's land, when his dog began behaving strangely. The animal barked insistently toward a ravine covered in dense vegetation. Jacob, intrigued and slightly concerned, decided to investigate. What he found among the bushes and under a thin layer of decomposing leaves were clearly abandoned personal belongings. There was a badly deteriorated leather suitcase, torn and scattered clothes, a broken pocket watch, and partially legible documents identifying the owner as Henry Patterson, the traveling salesman who had disappeared months earlier. Jacob immediately reported his discovery to Sheriff Hutchinson. The objects were carefully examined in the small police office in Grayson Mills. What most caught the authorities' attention was the condition of the belongings. They didn't appear to have been simply lost or abandoned by accident. The clothes were torn in ways that suggested they had been hastily removed. The suitcase had been opened and rummaged through, as if someone were searching for something specific. Even more disturbing was the fact that all items of obvious monetary value had been removed. There was no money, nor were there any of the expensive tools Henry usually carried to sell. Only personal items with no commercial value remained, discarded like trash. The sheriff organized a wider search of the area where the belongings were found. A 12-man team searched the area for 3 consecutive days. They found more evidence scattered across a radius of approximately 2 miles. Scraps of fabric caught in branches, more of Henry's personal documents, and something that made everyone's blood run cold. Marks on the ground that suggested something heavy had been dragged a considerable distance deeper into the forest. The marks were old, partially erased by winter but still visible to trained eyes. Following these tracks, the team reached a particularly isolated and difficult-to-access area. There, among rocks and dense vegetation, they found signs that someone had dug recently. The ground was suspiciously uneven, and the vegetation in these areas appeared younger, as if transplanted to cover something. Sheriff Hutchinson made the decision to dig. What they discovered that April day left no doubt that they were dealing with something much more sinister than simple disappearances. Human remains were found in 2 shallow, poorly concealed graves. Accurate identification would have been impossible without modern forensic resources that simply didn't exist at the time, but articles of clothing found with the remains matched the descriptions of Henry Patterson and Sarah Jennings. The news spread through the mountain communities like wildfire. Fear gripped the people. These mountains had always been perceived as dangerous because of the bears, the harsh winters, and the treacherous trails, but the idea that someone could be deliberately harming innocent travelers defied comprehension. Local churches organized vigils, and families began locking their doors more carefully, even in communities where such precautions had never been necessary before. Sheriff Hutchinson knew he needed to act quickly. With the evidence found so close to the Caldwell property, and considering the pattern of disappearances in the area, he finally had legal justification to obtain a search warrant. The county judge, an elderly man named Arthur Pemberton, signed the warrant without hesitation. The operation was planned for dawn on April 23, 1892. The sheriff assembled a group of 15 men, including his deputy and several town volunteers. All were armed and prepared for the worst. The drive up to the Caldwell estate was tense and silent. The sun had barely risen when they arrived, and a thick fog still hung over the trees, creating a ghostly atmosphere. The house seemed abandoned at first glance. There was no smoke coming from the chimney, no sound of activity. The sheriff knocked loudly on the door, announcing his presence and the authority of the warrant. There was no answer. After waiting a reasonable amount of time, he ordered the door forced open. The interior of the house revealed a scene of disturbing disarray. Furniture was overturned, objects scattered across the floor as if someone had left in a hurry. The kitchen bore signs that a meal had been recently prepared, but not consumed. Moldy bread lay on the table, and a pot of something unidentifiable sat on the cold stovetop. But most disturbing was the sheer number of personal items that clearly did not belong to the Caldwell family. Clothes of various sizes and styles were piled in a corner of the master bedroom. Suitcases and overnight bags were piled in a closet. Watches, modest jewelry, pocket knives, and Bibles with names inscribed on the covers. It was as if the house were a repository of interrupted lives. Representative Hayes found something particularly disturbing in the basement. There, amidst the dank darkness, were shelves filled with jars and containers. Inside, preserved in ways that suggested some rudimentary knowledge of taxidermy or conservation, were items that should never be in a normal home. The group decided not to remove anything until they could properly document everything. The feeling that they were violating something deeply wrong weighed heavily on everyone. But where were Thomas and Margaret Caldwell? The search for the property extended beyond the house. The men searched the barn, the storage rooms, every corner of the land. It was late in the afternoon that one of the volunteers called for help. He had found a newly cleared trail leading into the densest part of the forest. The vegetation had been disturbed, branches broken, and hurried footprints in the still damp soil. The group followed this trail as daylight began to fade, knowing they needed to find answers before darkness forced them to return. The trail led them to a small, primitive cabin, hidden so deep in the forest that it would have been impossible to find it without knowing exactly where to look. The structure was crude, made of poorly fitted logs and covered with branches and foliage that perfectly camouflaged it. As the sheriff approached, he heard low voices coming from inside. He ordered whoever was inside to come out immediately. After a long silence, the door creaked, and Margaret Caldwell emerged, followed by Thomas. Both had blank expressions as if in a trance. They didn't resist arrest. They didn't say a word. They simply allowed themselves to be led down the mountain as night fell over the Appalachians, shrouding everything in deep shadows and a heavy silence. Transporting Thomas and Margaret Caldwell to Grayson Mills Jail took several hours. The descent from the mountain was dangerous even during the day, and making it at dusk with 2 prisoners required extreme caution. The couple remained completely silent throughout the journey, their faces illuminated only by the flickering light of the men's lanterns. Margaret stared straight ahead, as if seeing something no one else could. Thomas kept his head down, his lips moving occasionally in inaudible murmurs that might have been prayers or something else entirely. When they finally arrived in town, it was already past midnight. The streets were deserted, but several windows remained lit. News of the arrests had spread quickly, and many residents were waiting awake, eager for any information. Sheriff Hutchinson ordered the couple placed in separate cells in the small police station complex. He knew he would need time to organize the interrogations and, more importantly, to process everything that had been found on that isolated mountain property. The following days were filled with intense investigative activity. A team returned to the Caldwell home to conduct a thorough inventory of all the objects found. What they documented was enough to send a shiver down even the most hardy man's spine. There were belongings belonging to at least 9 different people. Men's and women's clothing, identity documents, personal letters, family Bibles, with carefully drawn family trees on the front pages. Each object told the story of a life that had been abruptly and violently cut short. Among the items found was a diary that had belonged to Sarah Jennings, the traveling teacher. The pages were stained and some were illegible, but enough remained intact to reveal harrowing details. Sarah had written about her encounter with the Caldwell family. She mentioned being initially greeted with strange hospitality, invited to dinner when she mentioned she still had a long way to go before nightfall. The diary's later entries were fragmented and jumbled, suggesting something in her drink or food had disoriented her. The last line she managed to write simply read, "I can't feel my legs. The door is locked." The sheriff also found meticulously kept financial records belonging to Thomas Caldwell. They were simple ledgers, but they revealed a disturbing pattern. Over the past 5 years, Thomas had made regular deposits into a bank in a larger town about 40 miles away. The amounts varied, but together they totaled approximately $3,000, a considerable fortune for someone who supposedly lived off subsistence farming on an isolated property. The origin of this money was obvious when correlated with the dates of reported disappearances in the area. Interrogations began on the 3rd day after the arrests. The county prosecutor, a seasoned lawyer named Samuel Whitmore, arrived from Richmond specifically to prosecute the case. Whitmore had a reputation for meticulousness and relentlessness in his pursuit of justice. He began with Margaret, believing she might be more likely to cooperate, or at least show some emotion that would reveal the truth behind these horrific events. Margaret was brought into the interrogation room on the morning of April 28th. She wore a simple cotton dress the city had provided, as her own clothes were in deplorable condition. Her hair, now clean, revealed premature grey for a woman of only 43. She sat in the hard wooden chair and fixed her eyes on a spot on the wall, refusing to look directly at anyone present. Prosecutor Whitmore began with simple questions about her life, trying to establish some kind of human connection before addressing the more difficult topics. Margaret responded in a monotone, as if reciting facts about someone else's life. She spoke of meeting Thomas in Richmond, where she worked as a seamstress. She described their marriage as something arranged out of mutual necessity rather than affection. She spoke of moving to the mountains as a fresh start, a chance to escape the painful memories of the city. But when Whitmore began asking questions about the missing travelers, about the belongings found in her home, Margaret simply stopped talking. Her lips pressed tightly together, and she returned that blank stare to the wall, as if a switch had been flipped inside her. Thomas proved even less cooperative. When brought in for questioning the next day, he completely refused to answer any questions, not out of defiance or anger, but out of a complete lack of engagement. It was as if he had retreated to some deep place within himself, a place where the voices of the outside world could not reach him. He sat motionless, breathing slowly, occasionally closing his eyes for long periods. The local doctor was called in to assess whether Thomas was faking his condition or if there was truly something wrong with his mental state. Dr. Edwin Marshall, the only physician in Grayson Mills, was nearly 70 years old and had practiced medicine for over 4 decades. He carefully examined Thomas, testing his reflexes, observing his reactions to stimuli. His conclusion was unsettling. Thomas showed no signs of obvious physical illness, but his behavior suggested what the doctor described as a dissolution of conscious will. It was as if Thomas had simply decided to withdraw from reality, retreating into an impenetrable silence that not even the threat of trial and execution could break. While interrogations failed to produce direct confessions, the investigation continued to gather devastating circumstantial evidence. Teams returned to the wooded areas near the Caldwell property and, guided by the marks and irregularities in the ground, found 3 more graves. The remains found there were examined by Dr. Marshall, who did the best he could with the limited resources available. He determined that at least 2 of the sets of remains were adult males, based on size and bone structure. The 3rd set was smaller, possibly a short woman or a young adult. The community of Grayson Mills and the surrounding area was in a collective state of shock. Vigils were held in local churches, not only for those confirmed missing, but also for all those who had passed through these mountains in recent years and were never seen again. Reverend Thomas McKinley, pastor of the town's Baptist church, offered sermons on the nature of evil and the importance of remaining vigilant. But his words offered little comfort to those who now realized that the danger came not only from the wilds of the mountains, but from the very humanity that supposedly shared their values and faith. Regional newspapers began covering the case extensively. The Richmond Times published a series of in-depth articles on the Appalachian disappearances as the case became known. Reporters traveled to Grayson Mills to interview witnesses and authorities. The story even attracted the attention of newspapers as far away as Philadelphia and Boston. There was something about the isolated nature of the crime, the apparent normalcy of the Caldwells contrasted with the darkness of their actions, that captured the public's morbid imagination. One of the most disturbing aspects to emerge during the investigation was the likely duration of the crimes. Based on the items found and Thomas's financial records, it became clear that the disappearances were not recent. There was evidence suggesting that the pattern had begun as early as 1887, just a few years after the couple had settled on the property. This meant that for approximately 5 years, Thomas and Margaret had operated freely, taking advantage of the isolated nature of their location and the vulnerability of lone travelers unlucky enough to cross their path. Prosecutor Whitmore began preparing the case for trial, knowing he would face significant challenges. There were no confessions. There were no direct witnesses to the crimes. All the evidence was circumstantial, though extremely compelling when considered together. He would need to construct a narrative that connected all the dots so irrefutably that no jury could fail to convict. And he would have to do this while navigating the legal limitations of the time, where many modern forensic procedures simply did not exist or were not accepted in court. The trial of Thomas and Margaret Caldwell was scheduled for early June 1892. The news brought unprecedented attention to the small town of Grayson Mills. The county courthouse, a modest red brick building that normally handled property disputes and petty crimes, became the center of one of Virginia's most closely watched criminal cases that year. People traveled from neighboring towns, some traveling over 60 miles, just to secure a seat in the packed galleries. The judge assigned to preside over the case was Arthur Pemberton, the same man who had signed the original search warrant. Pemberton was 68 years old and had a reputation for impartiality built over 3 decades on the bench. He understood the gravity of the case and the need to ensure the proceedings followed all proper legal protocols, knowing that the eyes of the entire state were on his court. The Caldwell's defense was handled by Jonathan Brewster, a Richmond attorney who took the case more out of professional obligation than any conviction in his client's innocence. Jury selection took 3 full days. Prosecutor Whitmore wanted men who could handle the disturbing nature of the evidence without becoming emotionally swayed. Brewster, on the other hand, looked for any sign of sympathy or willingness to consider alternative explanations. In the end, 12 men were chosen, all local landowners, ranging in age from 32 to 57. None of them knew the Caldwells personally, but all were familiar with mountain life and the challenges it entailed. The trial officially began on the morning of June 7th. The summer heat was already beginning to set in, and the courtroom windows remained open in the hope of some breeze to alleviate the discomfort. Thomas and Margaret were brought into the courtroom handcuffed, escorted by 4 guards. Margaret wore the same simple dress she had worn during the interrogations, while Thomas wore clean but clearly old and patched clothes. Both maintained the same posture of silence and detachment they had displayed since their arrests. Prosecutor Whitmore opened the case with a carefully crafted speech. He avoided overly emotional or dramatic language, preferring to present the facts methodically and devastatingly. He described the series of disappearances that had plagued the region, the proximity of all these incidents to the Caldwell property, and the compelling evidence found both in the house and in the graves discovered in the woods. His voice was firm and controlled, but the room remained utterly silent, each word falling like a stone into still water. The first witnesses called were family members of the missing. Sarah Jennings's sister, Elizabeth Porter, traveled from Maryland to testify. She described Sarah as dedicated, courageous, and full of life, someone who had chosen a difficult profession because she genuinely believed in the power of education. Elizabeth identified several objects found in the Caldwell home as belonging to her sister, including a Bible with a personal inscription on the cover and a silver brooch that had belonged to their mother. When Elizabeth began to cry silently on the witness stand, Judge Pemberton offered a moment's pause, but she insisted on continuing, determined to give a voice to the sister who could no longer speak for herself. Henry Patterson's brother, the traveling merchant, also testified. James Patterson described how meticulous Henry was in his routes and communications, always sending letters home when he arrived in new towns. Henry's sudden and complete disappearance was completely out of character. James identified the pocket watch found in the ravine as belonging to his brother, recognizing a specific mark on the watch's face that Henry had made years earlier. The pain in his voice was palpable when he mentioned that Henry had planned to retire after a few more years of work, dreaming of buying a small shop in a larger city. Sheriff Hutchinson was called to detail the investigation. He spent nearly a full day on the witness stand, describing each step of the process: the initial reports of disappearances, the discovery of Henry Patterson's belongings, the excavations that uncovered the graves, and finally, the search of the Caldwell property. His narrative was precise and professional, but even he couldn't completely hide the turmoil he felt as he recalled what had been found in that isolated mountain home. When asked about the Caldwells' reaction to their arrest, he described the disconcerting silence and the lack of any apparent emotion, as if they were witnessing events that didn't directly involve them. Deputy Hayes supplemented the sheriff's testimony with details about the objects found in the basement. He described the shelves, the jars, the containers containing things no one should keep. Judge Pemberton instructed Hayes to be discreet in his descriptions, aware that overly graphic details would not only violate court decorum, but could also harm the proceedings by sensationalizing them. Hayes followed the instruction carefully, providing enough information to establish the disturbing nature of the discoveries without going into specifics that could cause unnecessary distress. Dr. Marshall was called to provide his medical opinion on the remains found in the graves. He frankly acknowledged the limitations of his analysis, given the condition of the remains and the limited resources available in a small community. However, he was able to confirm that the remains were human, that they represented at least 5 different individuals, and that based on deterioration and other factors, some had been buried several years ago. He also testified about his examination of Thomas Caldwell, describing the peculiar mental state he had observed, although he acknowledged that he did not have sufficient expertise in mental illness to offer a definitive diagnosis. Jonathan Brewster's defense was limited by his own client's lack of cooperation. Thomas and Margaret continued to refuse to speak, even to their own attorney. Brewster tried to argue that the evidence was purely circumstantial, that the belongings could have reached the Caldwell estate by other means, that the nearby graves didn't necessarily prove his clients were responsible, but his arguments sounded weak even to him. The amount of evidence, the clear pattern that emerged during the trial, and the specific nature of the objects found made it nearly impossible to construct any credible alternative narrative. Brewster tried a different tactic, suggesting that Margaret might have been the victim of coercion or dominance by Thomas. He presented witnesses who had known the couple and who described Thomas as controlling and Margaret as submissive and often fearful. A distant neighbor, a farmer named Ezekiel Stone, testified that he once saw Thomas treating Margaret roughly, tugging on her arm with unnecessary force when she had lingered in conversation during a rare visit to town. Brewster argued that Margaret might have been so under Thomas's influence that she had no choice but to participate, or at the very least, remain silent about his actions. Prosecutor Whitmore countered by presenting evidence that Margaret had actively participated in at least some of the interactions with the victims. A letter found among Sarah Jennings's belongings mentioned that she had been met at the door by a woman matching Margaret's description. Sarah's diary also suggested that Margaret had prepared the meal that had apparently left her incapacitated. Whitmore argued that even if Margaret had been under Thomas's influence, she had had numerous opportunities over the years to seek help or report the crimes, and her continued silence made her equally culpable. The trial stretched on for 3 weeks. With each day, more details emerged, more connections were made, and the picture of a systematic and prolonged pattern of predation solidified. The journalists present filled pages and pages with their notes, submitting daily articles to their newspapers that were avidly read by thousands of people across the region. The Caldwell case had become more than just a criminal trial. It had become a dark mirror reflecting deep fears about trust, isolation, and the fragility of civilization on America's wild frontiers. As the trial progressed, Prosecutor Whitmore began to construct a detailed chronology of events. He presented the jury with a meticulously constructed chart connecting the dates of reported disappearances with Thomas Caldwell's financial records. The correlation was disturbing in its precision. Approximately 2 to 3 weeks after each documented disappearance, Thomas had made a bank deposit for amounts ranging from $200 to $500. For a man who allegedly made his living from subsistence farming, these transactions were inexplicable by legitimate means. The bank manager in Withville, where Thomas held his account, was called to testify. Horatio Fleming was a meticulous-looking man with nearly 40 years of banking experience. He described Thomas as a peculiar customer who always arrived alone, often covered in dust from the long journey, and who conducted his transactions with as little conversation as possible. Fleming had never questioned the source of the money, assuming Thomas might have been selling lumber or agricultural products in distant markets. Now, reflecting on those visits in light of recent events, Fleming admitted to feeling a nagging guilt for not having been more attentive. A particularly revealing aspect of the case emerged when the prosecutor presented correspondence found among the belongings in the Caldwell home. There were letters addressed to several of the victims, some never opened, others clearly read. A letter addressed to Henry Patterson came from his wife, written weeks before his disappearance, mentioning that she was anxious for his return and had saved enough money to finally repair the roof. The letter never reached its recipient. It had finished its journey in the Caldwell home, archived along with other fragments of interrupted lives. The most powerful testimony came from a survivor. Nathan Brooks was an itinerant preacher who traveled the mountains offering sermons to isolated communities. In November of 1891, he approached the Caldwell estate at dusk, lost and searching for directions. He was met by Margaret, who invited him inside and rested. Nathan described the strange atmosphere of the house, the way Thomas watched him intently without saying much, and how Margaret had insisted he try a special tea she had prepared. Nathan had a habit of fasting during his travels as a spiritual practice, and had politely declined both the food and drink offered, explaining his religious vows. He noticed a subtle but noticeable change in the couple's demeanor after his refusal. Thomas became visibly tense, and Margaret appeared nervous. When Nathan mentioned that he had informed the community where he had preached that morning of his planned route and destination, including his intention to stop at the Caldwell estate for directions, Thomas quickly offered detailed instructions on the best route to take. Nathan departed before full darkness, but not without noticing the intense, unsettling look Thomas gave him as he walked away. At the time, Nathan had thought the encounter merely odd, attributing the peculiar behavior to the isolation and eccentricities common among those who chose to live so far from society. Only when he read about the Caldwell's arrests months later did he understand the real danger he had faced. His testimony provided the jury with rare insight into the Caldwell's likely method: hospitality as entrapment, incapacitating substances mixed into food or drink, and a preference for victims who would not have disclosed their plans or exact location to anyone. The defense attempted to question the reliability of Nathan's memory, suggesting that he might be retrospectively interpreting an innocent encounter through the lens of later events. But Nathan remained steadfast in his testimony, describing specific details of the house that matched exactly what had been documented by investigators, including the arrangement of furniture and particular objects that he would not have known had he not actually been there. Another crucial element presented by the prosecutor was the testimony of Wytheville merchants and residents who had occasionally seen Thomas selling items at local markets. A woman named Dorothy Sinclair recalled purchasing a set of carpentry tools from Thomas in October 1891 for a remarkably low price. The tools were of exceptional quality, engraved with initials she hadn't noticed at the time. When the tools were shown again during the trial, the initials were clearly visible. H.P. Henry Patterson had been known for his collection of top-quality tools, which he used to demonstrate products to his customers. Jonathan Brewster's defense strategy became increasingly desperate. He attempted to argue the possibility of insanity, suggesting that both Thomas and Margaret might be suffering from some form of shared delusion or mental illness that prevented them from understanding the nature of their actions. He called a Richmond physician, Dr. Albert Cunningham, who had studied mental illness in European hospitals. Cunningham testified about conditions such as folie à deux, a rare phenomenon in which two close people develop shared delusions, often in situations of extreme isolation. Prosecutor Whitmore, however, was prepared for this argument. He cross-examined Cunningham extensively, establishing that the doctor had never personally examined Thomas or Margaret, that his opinion was purely theoretical, and that the Caldwells' behavior, particularly the methodical nature of their actions and their attempt to conceal evidence, suggested a full awareness of wrongdoing. The keeping of detailed financial records, the calculated sale of victims' belongings, and the concealment of remains in hidden graves all pointed to individuals who fully understood the criminality of their actions and took deliberate measures to avoid detection. As the trial neared its conclusion, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly heavy. The jury members, who had heard weeks of harrowing testimony, displayed clear signs of emotional fatigue. Several of them appeared to have aged years in just a few weeks, their faces etched by exposure to a darkness they likely never imagined existed so close to their own communities. Judge Pemberton also showed signs of the weight of the case, his hands trembling slightly as he leafed through documents, his voice occasionally breaking when he had to repeat particularly grim details for clarification. Throughout the trial, Thomas and Margaret remained almost completely still and silent. They didn't react to any of the witnesses, showed no emotion when confronted with evidence of their crimes, and made no attempt to defend or explain themselves. It was as if they were physically present, but spiritually absent, their consciousnesses withdrawn to some inaccessible place. This absence of apparent humanity made them all the more disturbing to those who observed them. It was easier to comprehend monsters that roared and thrashed than these empty figures, who simply existed in silence, offering no window into the motivations or thought processes that had led to so many deaths. Closing arguments began on the morning of June 27th. The heat had intensified, and the air inside the courtroom felt thick and difficult to breathe. Jonathan Brewster did the best he could with the impossible circumstances he faced. He appealed to the jury's humanity, asking them to consider the possibility that his clients were victims of forces beyond their comprehension or control, that extreme isolation in the mountains had corrupted their minds in ways people in normal communities would never experience. His speech was eloquent, but deep down everyone in the room knew it was a lost cause. Prosecutor Whitmore closed the case with a devastating summary of all the evidence presented. He spoke for over 3 hours, connecting every thread of the investigation into an irrefutable tapestry of guilt. He used no inflammatory rhetoric or excessive emotional appeals. He didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves with terrifying clarity. He concluded by urging the jury to seek justice, not only for the victims whose remains had been found, but for all the people who had disappeared in those mountains over the years, whose fates might never be fully known, but whose memory deserved recognition, and whose families deserved the closure that only a guilty verdict could provide. The jury retired for deliberations on the afternoon of June 27th. Judge Pemberton instructed the 12 men on their duties, emphasizing the need to consider only the evidence presented during the trial and to reach a unanimous verdict. He explained the legal standards for first-degree murder, the distinction between premeditation and impulse, and the importance of setting aside any personal prejudice or emotion when assessing the guilt of the accused. His voice was solemn, carrying the weight of the responsibility he was transferring to these men. The wait for the decision was excruciating for everyone involved. The town of Grayson Mills seemed to suspend its normal activities while awaiting the verdict. Merchants remained in their shops, but paid little attention to their business, their gaze constantly straying toward the courthouse. Women gathered in small groups at churches, some praying, others simply seeking comfort in one another's company. Children sensed the tension in the adults around them, even without fully understanding the nature of the events that had transformed their small town into the center of such attention. The jury deliberated for approximately 6 hours. Some of the older men in town, veterans of previous trials, commented that it was a surprisingly short time considering the gravity of the case and the volume of evidence, but those who had followed the trial closely were not surprised. The overwhelming nature of the evidence left little room for reasonable doubt. When the courthouse bell rang, announcing the jury's decision, hundreds of people converged on the building, filling every available seat and crowding the outer corridors. Thomas and Margaret were brought back to the courtroom at 7 o'clock in the evening. Late afternoon light streamed in through the tall windows, creating golden patterns on the wooden walls. The contrast between the serene beauty of that light and the darkness of what was being judged was almost painful to contemplate. The defendants took their positions with the same blank posture they had maintained throughout the proceedings. If they felt any anxiety about what was about to be announced, there was no sign of it on their expressionless faces. Judge Pemberton called for absolute silence in the courtroom. The jury foreman, a respected farmer named William Garrett, stood with a trembling paper in his hands. His voice was hoarse with emotion as he read the verdict. On the first-degree murder charge of Henry Patterson, guilty. On the first-degree murder charge of Sarah Jennings, guilty, and so on through all the charges presented. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The word echoed in the silent room like a death sentence being pronounced over and over, which indeed it was exactly that. When Garrett finally sat down, exhausted by the weight of what he had just done, Judge Pemberton thanked the jury for their service and set the sentencing hearing for 2 days later. The crowd began to slowly disperse, people filing out of the courtroom in contemplative silence. There was no celebration, no sense of victory, only a somber, weary relief that some form of justice had been achieved, though everyone knew that no verdict could bring back the dead or erase the trauma their crimes had inflicted on the victims' families and the community at large. The sentencing hearing took place on the morning of June 29th. Virginia law at the time allowed only one sentence for first-degree murder with multiple victims: death by hanging. Judge Pemberton had no discretion to impose a more lenient sentence, even if he had wished. He pronounced the sentence firmly, but clearly affected by the gravity of the moment. Thomas and Margaret Caldwell would be executed by hanging on August 30th, 1892, approximately 2 months from that date. The execution would take place in the county jail yard, as was standard practice at the time. Even in this final moment, when the reality of their fate was formally announced, Thomas and Margaret showed no visible reaction. They were led back to their cells without resistance, without words, without tears. Their passive acceptance was almost more disturbing than any protestation of innocence or display of despair would have been. It was as if the death that awaited them was simply another meaningless event in existences already emptied of any real connection to life. The next 2 months were a strange period of waiting. The press's attention gradually shifted to other matters, though occasional articles still appeared recounting aspects of the case or speculating about the condemned men's final days. Reverend McKinley regularly visited Thomas and Margaret in their cells, attempting to offer spiritual solace and encourage them to confess their sins before they met their Maker. His efforts were largely fruitless. Margaret occasionally murmured a few words of acknowledgement when he prayed, but never offered anything approaching a confession or explanation. Thomas remained almost completely silent, occasionally responding to direct questions with nods, but never truly engaging in meaningful communication. During this time, teams of investigators continued to scour the mountains surrounding the Caldwell property, looking for more graves or evidence of additional victims. They found 3 more burial sites, bringing the total number of confirmed victims to 8. There were suspicions that there might be more, perhaps many more, but the mountains were vast, and the possibilities for hiding places were virtually endless. Families of people who had disappeared in the area over the past decade began sending letters to Sheriff Hutchinson, asking if their loved ones might be among the victims. Each letter was a blade of pain and desperate hope for answers that would likely never come. The Caldwell estate became an object of morbid curiosity. People traveled there just to gaze at the house from afar, as if the building itself might offer some clue to the horrors that had occurred within its walls. The sheriff eventually had to post guards to prevent break-ins and vandalism. There was debate in the community about what should be done with the property. Some argued that it should be burned, purified by fire, as if it could somehow cleanse the stain of crimes. Others suggested that it should be preserved as a grim reminder of the dangers of human nature. In the end, the decision was postponed indefinitely, and the house remained empty and decaying, slowly being reclaimed by the surrounding forest. Jacob Thornton, the farmer who had made the initial discovery of Henry Patterson's belongings, never fully recovered from the role he had played in sparking the entire investigation. He had developed chronic insomnia, tormented by thoughts of how many other travelers might have been saved if he had noticed something strange sooner. His wife reported to the local doctor that Jacob would frequently wake in the middle of the night, sweating and shaking, claiming to hear voices calling for help from the woods. Dr. Marshall prescribed laudanum to help him sleep, but everyone knew that some wounds were beyond the reach of contemporary medicine. The families of the confirmed victims received their loved ones' belongings that had been recovered from the Caldwell home. Each delivery was a painful ceremony, with family objects returned without the people who had carried them. Elizabeth Porter, Sarah Jennings's sister, organized a memorial service in Maryland for her sister, even though she didn't have a body to bury. She spoke to the assembled congregation about Sarah's courage, her commitment to education, and how her light had been extinguished too soon by incomprehensible forces of evil. Many in the congregation wept openly, not just for Sarah but for all victims, and for a world where such things could happen. As August approached, tensions in Grayson Mills rose again. Public executions, though common at the time, were events that divided communities. Some saw them as necessary justice and a deterrent to future crimes. Others considered them barbaric acts that lowered society to the same level as the criminals they executed. Judge Pemberton, sensitive to these divisions, ruled that the execution would not be an open public spectacle. Only a limited number of official witnesses would be allowed: law enforcement officials, some members of the press, Reverend McKinley, and immediate family members of the victims who wished to attend. Elizabeth Porter was one of those who chose to be present. When asked by friends why she would put herself through such an ordeal, she simply replied that she owed it to Sarah. She needed to see with her own eyes that those who had taken her sister from the world faced their own consequences. James Patterson, Henry's brother, made the same decision. He traveled from Ohio, where he now lived, specifically to witness the end of his brother's killers. His presence was silent, but charged with a deep sadness that weighed visibly on his hunched shoulders. The final days of August brought a stifling heat to the Appalachian mountains. The air felt stagnant, heavy with the humidity that precedes summer thunderstorms. On the morning of August 30th, 1892, the sky dawned covered in grey clouds that seemed to reflect the somber mood of the occasion. The county jail yard had been prepared overnight. A simple but functional wooden structure had been erected, 2 rope loops swaying gently in the occasional breeze that managed to penetrate the oppressive heat. Thomas and Margaret were awakened before dawn. The guards reported that they had both spent their last night in silence, showing no signs of fear or regret. Margaret had slept peacefully, according to hourly observations. Thomas had remained awake most of the night, sitting in his cell, staring out the small window that overlooked the darkening sky. When the guards arrived to escort them, they both rose without resistance, allowing themselves to be prepared with the same passivity they had demonstrated throughout the court proceedings. Reverend McKinley arrived at the prison at 5 in the morning. He had spent the night in prayer, seeking strength to witness what was about to happen and to offer what spiritual comfort he could in the condemned men's final moments. He first visited Margaret in her cell. She sat calmly on her cot, wearing a simple white cotton dress the community had provided for the occasion. Her hair had been combed and tied modestly. As the Reverend began to speak of redemption and divine forgiveness, Margaret looked directly at him for the first time in months. Her eyes, which had seemed so empty throughout the trial, now held something different. Not exactly regret, but perhaps a kind of wistful acceptance that everything was coming to an end. The Reverend asked Margaret if she wished to confess her sins, to offer some word of explanation or repentance that might bring peace to her soul before facing the final judgment. Margaret opened her mouth as if to speak, and for a moment it seemed she would finally break the silence she had maintained for so long. But then she simply nodded slowly and returned her gaze to the ground. The moment passed, and with it, any hope of understanding the motivations or thought processes that had led to the terrible crimes for which she would be executed in a few hours. With Thomas, the Reverend had even less success. The man remained in his almost catatonic state of detachment, responding to the clergyman's prayers and words only with impenetrable silence. McKinley prayed beside Thomas for nearly an hour, his words echoing in the empty prison corridor, but receiving no verbal response or even clear acknowledgement that they were being heard. Eventually the Reverend stood, his joints aching from so much time kneeling on the cold stone floor, and admitted defeat in his efforts to reach the man's soul. The official witnesses began arriving around 7 in the morning. Elizabeth Porter arrived accompanied by her husband, who tried until the last moment to dissuade her from watching, but she remained firm in her decision. James Patterson arrived alone, his face showing the lack of sleep and the emotional toll of the past few months. Sheriff Hutchinson and his deputy Hayes were present, as were Prosecutor Whitmore and Judge Pemberton. 3 reporters from different newspapers had been granted permission to attend, including one from the Richmond Times, who had covered the case from the beginning. In all, approximately 20 people gathered in the enclosed courtyard where the execution would take place. At 8 in the morning, the local church bells rang, marking the appointed hour. Thomas was brought in first, escorted by 4 guards. His hands were tied in front of him, and his steps were slow but steady. He glanced briefly at the cloudy sky as he entered the courtyard, then lowered his eyes and did not raise them again. The executioner, a man named Daniel Frost, who had been brought from Richmond specifically for this task, positioned Thomas on the platform. Frost was known for his efficiency and for ensuring that executions were as quick and painless as possible, considering the nature of the procedure. Margaret was brought in next. She walked with surprising dignity, her posture erect, her steps measured. When she saw Thomas already positioned on the platform, something flitted across her face, an emotion too quick to be clearly identified. It might have been sadness, or perhaps just resignation. She took her position beside her husband without needing guidance, as if she had rehearsed this moment in her mind many times. Sheriff Hutchinson formally read the sentences, his voice firm but clearly affected by the gravity of the moment. He listed the crimes for which Thomas and Margaret Caldwell had been convicted and the death sentence that had been imposed. When he finished, he asked if the condemned men had any last words. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity. Thomas remained completely still, his lips tightly closed. Margaret opened her mouth, and for a moment everyone leaned forward, waiting to finally hear her voice. But she merely whispered something so softly that not even the nearest guards could make out the words. Then she too fell silent. Reverend McKinley offered a final prayer, asking for mercy for the souls of the condemned and peace for the families of the victims. His voice shook several times during the prayer, and tears silently streamed down his weathered face. When he finished, he stepped back and nodded to the executioner. Frost worked quickly and professionally, positioning the hoods over the condemned men's heads and adjusting the nooses. Margaret's last sound was a deep sigh, as if releasing all the air she had held inside for months. Thomas remained silent until the end. At 8:23 in the morning, the levers were pulled. The sound of the trapdoors opening echoed through the enclosed courtyard like thunder. It was all over in a matter of seconds. Dr. Marshall, present to confirm the deaths, waited the appropriate amount of time before climbing onto the platform to perform his examination. He pronounced both dead at 8:27 in the morning. 4 minutes had been enough to end 2 lives that had taken so many others over years of silent predation in the mountains. The witnesses began to slowly disperse. Elizabeth Porter stood still for a long time, staring at the motionless form still suspended above the platform. Her husband tried to guide her away, but she gently resisted, needing that moment to process what she had just witnessed. Finally, she turned and walked toward the exit, her shoulders hunched but her step firm. James Patterson said a brief, silent prayer before leaving, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched his hat. Reporters were already scribbling furiously in their notebooks, capturing every detail for their articles. The bodies of Thomas and Margaret Caldwell were buried in an unconsecrated area of the local cemetery, far from the graves of respectable citizens. There were no headstones marking the sites, only small wooden stakes with numbers. Reverend McKinley insisted on holding a brief funeral service, despite opposition from some community members who felt the killers did not deserve even this minimal recognition of their humanity. McKinley argued that all were children of God, no matter how far they had fallen, and that refusing final rites would be to lower the community to the level of barbarity they had condemned. Only he, 2 gravediggers and a guard were present when the simple coffins were lowered into the earth. In the days following the execution, Grayson Mills tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but the town had been permanently altered by the events of the past few months. There was a new, uncomfortable awareness that evil could exist not just in faraway places or in stories told to scare children, but right here in the mountains they had always called home. People looked at their neighbors with slightly more suspicious eyes. Travelers were greeted with more caution. The world seemed a little less safe than it had been before. In the weeks following the executions, attention turned to the victims whose identities had yet to be confirmed. Sheriff Hutchinson had kept meticulous records of every belonging found on the Caldwell property, and now these objects became the only hope for desperate families seeking answers about missing loved ones. Letters arrived daily from across Virginia, and even neighboring states, each containing harrowing descriptions of people who had left on journeys and never returned. One such letter came from Catherine Whitfield, a widow from Charleston, West Virginia. She wrote about her brother, Michael Brennan, a Civil War veteran who had become a peddler after the conflict. Michael had left on a business trip in September 1888 and simply disappeared. Catherine described in detail a specific military medal that Michael always carried, engraved with his name and unit. Among the catalogued objects in the Caldwell home, there was exactly one medal matching that description. The sheriff sent the medal to Catherine, and her reply letter, stained with tears that stained the ink, confirmed the identification. After 4 years of painful uncertainty, she finally had an answer, however terrible it was. Another identification came through a distinctive pocket watch found among the belongings. The watch had a caseback, engraved with an elaborate eagle design, and the initials RTM. The Morrison family of Norfolk immediately recognized the watch as belonging to Robert Timothy Morrison, an engineer who had been traveling through the Appalachians in 1889, studying possible routes for railroad expansion. Robert was only 31 when he disappeared, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children. His wife, Anne Morrison, had never remarried, holding out hope that one day he would return. The confirmation of his death, though devastating, brought a cruel kind of peace that finally allowed her to begin the proper grieving process. The identification process revealed that the Caldwell victims came from all walks of life. There were merchants and teachers, engineers and preachers, war veterans and young adventurers. What they all shared was the vulnerability of being lone travelers in a remote region, people whose disappearances would not raise immediate alarms because they were expected to be on the move. The Caldwells had been selective in their choices, preferring those who could disappear without immediate or extensive investigation. While these identifications brought painful closure to some families, there were many objects that were never claimed. There were clothing without distinguishing marks, common tools that could have belonged to anyone, and some personal items that simply could not be connected to any specific missing person. These orphaned objects represented victims whose identities would remain forever unknown, people who had been erased so completely that not even their belongings could testify to who they had been. Sheriff Hutchinson kept these items in a special box in the station's storage room, unable to discard them, but equally unable to do anything useful with them. The Caldwell estate became the subject of prolonged legal debate. Technically, the land should have passed to any legal heirs, but no close relatives came forward to claim it. Thomas had a distant cousin who lived in Ohio, but he categorically refused any association with the property or the family, even changing his surname to avoid social contamination of the connection. Eventually, after months of legal proceedings, the property was seized by the county and sold at public auction to cover trial and execution costs. The sale of the property was a somber affair. Few wanted to be associated with this land stained with so much blood. The auction attracted mostly curious onlookers and a few unscrupulous speculators hoping to get a cheap deal. In the end, the property was purchased by a rancher from a distant region who had no connection to Grayson Mills and planned to use the land strictly for cattle grazing, completely avoiding the existing house. He never demolished the structure, allowing it to simply rot slowly, swallowed by the aggressive mountain vegetation. Over the years that followed, the Caldwell house became something of a dark legend in the area. Stories circulated about strange sounds heard coming from the property at night, about lights flickering in the abandoned house's windows when no one was there. These stories were likely simply the product of overstimulated imaginations and the natural human desire to create supernatural narratives around places associated with tragedy. But they served a purpose. They kept the memory of what had happened there alive, ensuring that the lessons of those terrible events would not be forgotten. The Caldwell case had repercussions that extended far beyond Grayson Mills. Across Virginia and neighboring states, communities began paying closer attention to missing travelers. What might previously have been dismissed as someone simply changing plans or getting lost in the vast woods now sparked more serious investigations. Sheriffs from different counties began sharing information more systematically, creating informal communication networks that would help detect suspicious patterns before they could result in so many victims. Roads and trails in the remote Appalachian regions saw gradual improvements in the following years. While no one explicitly cited the Caldwell case as a motivation, there was a tacit understanding that keeping travelers safer and better connected to the communities they passed through could prevent similar tragedies. Small inns and rest stops were established at more regular intervals along the main routes, offering safer alternatives to relying on the hospitality of strangers in isolated properties. For those directly involved in the case, the impact was profound and lasting. Sheriff Hutchinson remained in his position for another 8 years before retiring. He never spoke publicly about the Caldwell case, but those close to him knew the memories haunted him. He developed a habit of taking long walks in the mountains, as if perpetually searching for something he would never find. When he died in 1903, he was found sitting peacefully under a tree on a high trail, gazing down at the valley below. Some said he had finally found peace. Others suspected he spent his final moments still thinking about the victims he failed to save. Representative Robert Hayes left law enforcement entirely after the case. He moved to a coastal town and became a fisherman, seeking in the vastness of the ocean a kind of cleansing that the mountains could no longer provide. He rarely mentioned his time as a representative, and when asked about the Caldwell case, he simply shook his head and changed the subject. Exposure to that darkness at such a young age had fundamentally altered his relationship with humanity and the world. Reverend McKinley continued to serve his congregation, but his sermons took on a different tone after the executions. He spoke less about sin and damnation and more about compassion and understanding. Some more conservative members of his church were uncomfortable with this shift, feeling he had become too soft on evil. But McKinley had looked into the eyes of people who had committed terrible acts and seen not monsters, but empty, broken humans. This experience had transformed his theology in ways he struggled to articulate, but felt deep in his soul. For the victims' families, there was no true closure, only the painful adjustment to a new reality. Elizabeth Porter eventually managed to establish a small memorial fund in her sister Sarah's name, offering scholarships to young women aspiring to become teachers in rural areas. It was her way of ensuring that Sarah's dream of bringing education to remote places would continue, even if Sarah herself could no longer do so. Each year, when a new scholarship was awarded, Elizabeth thought of her sister and the life that should have been. The years following the Caldwell case brought significant changes to Virginia's Appalachian mountains. The 19th century was drawing to a close, and with it came transformations that slowly altered the mountains' isolated character. The expansion of railroads reached areas previously considered inaccessible, connecting remote communities to growing urban centers. The telegraph became more common, allowing faster communication between distant cities. These technological innovations brought unquestionable benefits, but they also gradually eliminated the kind of profound isolation that had allowed the Caldwells to operate undetected for so long. Grayson Mills grew modestly during this period. The population increased from 200 to approximately 400 by the beginning of the new century. New families arrived, attracted by the coal mining and logging opportunities that were beginning to expand in the region. With this growth came a gradual loss of collective memory about the events of 1892. For the newcomers, the Caldwell case was merely a dark story from the past, not the open wound that remained for those who had lived through it. But for some, the search for answers never fully ended. In 1911, a Richmond investigative journalist named Arthur Hensley arrived in Grayson Mills, intent on writing a book about the case. Hensley specialized in unsolved crimes and forgotten criminal justice stories. He spent 3 months in the area, interviewing anyone willing to talk, combing through old records, and even visiting the abandoned Caldwell estate. His work produced the most comprehensive account of the case compiled to date. During his investigations, Hensley made a puzzling discovery. In the church records of a small community, about 50 miles from Grayson Mills, he found reference to a marriage between Thomas Caldwell and a woman named Mary Sullivan in 1869. This was 3 years before Thomas allegedly met Margaret in Richmond. Hensley tracked down additional records and discovered that Mary had died under mysterious circumstances just 6 months after the wedding. The local doctor at the time had listed the cause of death as a fever, but he had not kept detailed records. The discovery raised disturbing questions about how many victims Thomas may have had throughout his life and whether Margaret was his first accomplice or if there were others before her. Hensley also interviewed people who had known the Caldwells before they moved to the mountains. An elderly seamstress in Richmond remembered Margaret working in the same sewing shop as her in the 1870s. She described Margaret as a quiet, sad woman who rarely smiled and seemed to carry some invisible weight. There were rumors, never confirmed, that Margaret had suffered a significant personal tragedy before meeting Thomas, one that had profoundly changed her. The exact nature of this tragedy remained obscure, lost in the gaps of history and the lack of reliable records. Hensley's book, published in 1893 under the title Shadows in the Appalachians, The True Story of the Caldwell Family, became a moderate success. It sold several thousand copies, primarily in the mid-Atlantic region, and briefly renewed public interest in the case. But as with all stories, eventually other news stories and scandals captured the public's attention, and the Caldwell case slipped back into the semi-darkness of regional history. The Caldwell estate continued its slow but inexorable deterioration. By 1911, the roof had completely collapsed, exposing the interior of the house to the elements. The walls began to buckle and crack. The forest was advancing aggressively, saplings sprouting through what had been the kitchen floor, vines climbing the exterior walls and penetrating through broken windows. Nature was methodically erasing all physical evidence of what had happened there, covering the horrors of the past with new layers of green growth. But the graves discovered in the surrounding mountains met a different fate. In 1966, a group of women from the community, led by the wife of the new sheriff, organized an effort to create a fitting memorial. They raised funds through bake sales and community events, and eventually succeeded in erecting a simple stone marker in a clearing high in the mountains. The inscription read simply, "In memory of the unknown travelers who perished in these mountains, may their souls find the peace denied them in life." It was a modest but meaningful acknowledgement of those who had been forgotten or never identified. The memorial became a place of silent pilgrimage for some. Occasionally, wildflowers were left there by anonymous hands. Travelers familiar with the history sometimes made detours to visit the site, paying their silent respects to victims they had never met. The memorial served as a tangible reminder that behind the statistics and newspaper headlines, there had been real people with lives, dreams, and families who loved them. As the first decade of the new century progressed, many of the key players in the original case began to pass away. Judge Pemberton died in 1905, taking with him memories of the trial he had presided over with such solemnity. Prosecutor Whitmore passed away in 1908, after a distinguished career that eventually included a seat on the state bench. Dr. Marshall, who had examined both the victims' remains and the defendants' mental states, died in 1909 at the age of 82. With each death, a portion of the living memory of the case faded, replaced by written accounts that, while preserving facts, could not fully capture the emotional atmosphere of those tumultuous days. Elizabeth Porter continued her advocacy for rural education until her own death in 1915. In her later years, she expanded Sarah's Memorial Fund to include not only scholarships, but also funding for small libraries in isolated communities. She saw this as a continuation of her sister's mission to bring knowledge and light to forgotten places. When Elizabeth died, she was buried next to her parents, with a headstone that commemorated not only her own life, but also the memory of Sarah Jennings, teacher, sister, light extinguished too soon. James Patterson never returned to Virginia after witnessing the Caldwell's execution. He lived the rest of his life in Ohio, working as a bookkeeper and raising a family. His children grew up knowing little about the tragedy that had taken their uncle, only that Uncle Henry had died young, under sad circumstances. James rarely spoke of the ordeal, but kept Henry's pocket watch in a special box on his desk. Occasionally, he would take it out and hold it, remembering the brother who had been so full of life and ambition, whose story had ended so abruptly and violently in the distant mountains. The region itself began to change in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1892. Roads were improved and paved. Electricity reached even the most remote areas. Automobiles began to replace horses and wagons, turning journeys that once took days into a matter of hours. With these changes, the kind of deep and dangerous isolation that had characterized the Appalachian Mountains in the late 19th century became increasingly rare. Progress brought security, but it also erased some of the wild and mysterious character that had defined the region for centuries. Local historians occasionally revisited the Caldwell case in their writings, often as part of broader studies of crime and justice in the post-Civil War period. Each new generation of researchers brought different perspectives, seeking to understand not only what had happened, but why. Some analyses focused on psychological aspects, attempting to apply emerging theories of criminal pathology to the Caldwell's behavior. Others examined social and economic factors, asking whether poverty and isolation had played a role in creating the conditions for such crimes. More than a century has passed since that dark summer of 1892, and the Caldwell family case remains one of the most disturbing chapters in Appalachian criminal history. The house that once held so many terrible secrets is long gone, completely consumed by the forest that now dominates this isolated hillside. Only a few foundation stones remain visible to those who know exactly where to look, half buried under decades of dead leaves and dense vegetation. Nature has exacted its own form of justice, erasing the physical structures, but never completely erasing the memory of what happened there. The Grayson County Archives still hold the original trial records, yellowed, fragile pages that document every detail of those events. Researchers occasionally request access to these documents, seeking to understand not only the specific crimes, but also what they reveal about human nature, and a time when the law struggled to reach the farthest corners of civilization. The records tell a factual story of investigation, trial, and execution, but the deeper questions remain largely unanswered. What turned Thomas and Margaret Caldwell into predators? Was it specific circumstances in their lives that led them down this dark path, or was there something inherently broken in their natures from the start? These questions were never satisfactorily answered during the trial, and the couple's stubborn refusal to offer any explanation ensured they remained enduring mysteries. Their silence was perhaps their ultimate act of control, denying the world the understanding the victims' families desperately sought. Modern scholars of criminal psychology view the Caldwell case through a lens that simply didn't exist in the late 19th century. They see possible patterns of psychopathic behavior, pathological relationship dynamics, and how geographic isolation may have facilitated and prolonged a series of crimes that in more connected environments would have been detected much earlier. But even with all the tools of modern science, much about the Caldwells remains speculative. Without confessions, without detailed diaries explaining their motivations, without direct access to their minds, we can only theorize about the thought processes that guided their horrific actions. The impact of the case extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. It fundamentally altered how rural communities thought about safety and trust. The tradition of hospitality to travelers, so essential in 19th century rural America, was tainted by a new awareness of potential danger. People became more cautious, more questioning, less willing to blindly trust the kindness of strangers. This change brought greater safety, but it also represented a loss of something valuable, an innocence about human nature that, once lost, could never be fully recovered. For the Appalachian region of Virginia, the case has become part of the local identity, a dark story simultaneously remembered and forgotten. Older residents still know the basic details, stories passed down through generations with the inevitable distortions and embellishments that accompany oral tradition. Visitors interested in dark history occasionally make pilgrimages to the area, though they find little to see beyond beautiful landscapes and historical plaques that briefly mention the events without going into disturbing detail. The stone memorial erected in 1966 still stands, though worn by time and the elements. The inscription has become harder to read over the decades, the letters gradually softening under the influence of rain, snow, and wind. But people continue to visit, occasionally leaving small tokens of remembrance: wildflowers in spring, colorful leaves in autumn, even small stones stacked neatly like silent markers that someone cared enough to stop and remember. The lessons of the Caldwell case resonate today. They remind us of the importance of effective communication systems, of connected communities where people pay attention when someone goes missing, of not allowing geographic isolation to create pockets where the law cannot reach. They highlight the vulnerability of those who travel alone, especially in remote areas, and the need for adequate infrastructure to protect the most exposed among us. But perhaps most fundamentally, the case reminds us that darkness can exist in unexpected places, hidden behind facades of normalcy, and that constant vigilance is the price of security in any society. Families descended from the victims have spread across the country for generations. Many are unaware of their ancestors' connection to that ancient case. For those who do, the story is often a painful footnote in family histories, a reminder of lives cut short and potential unrealized. Occasionally, descendants connect with one another through online genealogical research, discovering unexpected connections through shared tragedy. These encounters can be comforting, creating a sense of community among those bound by losses that occurred long before they were born. The Caldwell family's story offers no easy answers or complete closure. It remains a haunting reminder that not all questions can be answered, not all wounds can be completely healed, and not all darkness can be fully understood. But by remembering and examining cases like this, we honor the memory of those lost and reaffirm our collective commitment to justice, vigilance, and the protection of the vulnerable. The Appalachian Mountains remain majestic and beautiful, their thick forests and deep valleys still inspiring awe in all who visit. But for those who know their history, there is always an underlying shadow, a knowledge that these same mountains once held terrible secrets. This duality, natural beauty contrasting with dark history, characterizes not only this specific region, but reflects something broader about the world we live in. Light and darkness coexist, often closer than we'd like to admit. Today, when travelers pass through the area where the Caldwell estate once stood, most have no idea of the history beneath their feet. They see only tree-covered mountains, crystal-clear streams, and vast skies. And perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps it is right that natural beauty eventually covers the horrors of the past, that life goes on, and that new chapters are written about the old. But for those of us who take the time to look deeper, to study history and remember the forgotten, these mountains will always carry echoes of the events of 1892. The Caldwell family story remains one of the most enigmatic and disturbing cases in American criminal history. Decades of research have not answered all the questions, and likely never will. But by keeping this memory alive, by telling this story to future generations, we ensure that those who perished are not completely forgotten. Their lives were taken, their stories cut short, but through remembrance, they maintain a presence in the world, a silent testament to the fragility of life and the importance of protecting one another. If this journey through the shadows of Appalachia touched you, if these forgotten stories deserve to be remembered, consider subscribing to the channel. There are many more disturbing stories and unsolved mysteries waiting to be explored, cases that have challenged investigators and continue to fascinate those of us who seek to understand the darkest corners of human history. Leave a like if you enjoyed this in-depth investigation, and in the comments tell us which aspect of this case resonated most with you. Are there other historical mysteries you'd like us to explore? Your input will help guide our next delve into the forgotten stories that have shaped our understanding of justice, humanity, and the mysteries that still haunt us through the centuries.